Happy Thanksgiving, and welcome to Theology Thursday. I'm aware that today is Thanksgiving, and so I'm going to keep this one pretty brief because I know that there's turkey to eat, mashed potatoes and gravy to eat, cranberry sauce to eat, and pumpkin pie to eat, and football games to watch, and family to fellowship with. So I'll keep this pretty brief, but I do want to talk about maybe the number one thing for which we need to be thankful, and that's history. So I was a history major in college. I love history. When my wife and I travel, oftentimes I'm told no history lectures because I do just find it fascinating what people have done in the past and how that has impacted where we are in the present. I just find history just incredibly fascinating because people haven't changed since the beginning of creation. And when it comes to history, this book, the Bible, is full of history. It starts off with Genesis is all history. Exodus, about the first half is history. The second half is the building of the tabernacle. Leviticus then has all the sacrifices and everything. Then we get to the book of Numbers. The entire thing is history. We get to Deuteronomy. It's Moses' last sermon, and quite a bit of it is the history of what God has done in the lives of his people and delivering them from Egypt. Joshua's history, Judges' history, Ruth's history, 1st and 2nd Samuel history, 1st and 2nd Kings are history, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are history, Ezra's history, Nehemiah's history, Esther's history. Job is kind of the history of one man, a particular episode in his life. The Psalms make constant and unending references to history and what God has done. Then we get Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon is somewhat history. It's the history of a romance between a young shepherd boy and the Shunammite woman, and Saul in all his beauty and glory trying to woo her away with what he could offer, but not his heart. Then we get the prophets, and the prophets a good deal in history. A good chunk of Jeremiah is actually a biography about his life. Isaiah talks a lot about history and all these kingdoms and empires that God is using, and Ezekiel is a lot of his own history. And then you get into all the minor prophets are all set in history. And then the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the history of Jesus. The book of Acts is history. All these places that the Apostle Paul writes letters to, Colossae and Philippi and Ephesus and the 7 churches that are written to in Rome, Thyatira and Philadelphia. All of those are real historical places with a history behind them. Almost all of the Bible involves history. And so there's a tremendous amount of history. But I want to say just a couple of things about the history in the Bible. There is a history that's just dry information. This is what happened. I recently read a book on the history of the Waffen-SS, which was the military branch run by Heinrich Himmler during World War II. And a good deal of the book was just who comprised and how many soldiers were in each division and where they went and what happened in different battles. It's pretty dry, dusty sort of history, like we often think of history. But then there's also history that's intended to teach. And this is particularly true with when we write history. So if you read like a biography of someone's life, or you read like the history of, say, World War I, or a lot of people in America are Civil War buffs, or I love to read about the War of Independence. It was launched by the Declaration of Independence on July 4th in 1776. And so we don't read every detail. We're not trying to give everything that happened to every single person. It's episodes. Certain episodes are picked because those episodes kind of summarize or highlight significant turning points, or they kind of represent what happened all the time. You're kind of representative of everyone. That what they would do in those days, how they fought war, battles, and those kind of things. And that's really kind of the history we have in the Bible. So we have an episode. So we get Adam and Eve, and then we get the whole Garden of Eden experience. They have a couple of sons, Cain and Abel. We get an episode of them, Cain and bringing their offerings, and Cain killing his brother Abel. Then we kind of get a couple of things about Cain. Then we get like a few things in Noah's life, and then we get some episodes of Abraham. But there's some big gaps of 10, 15 years or more in Abraham's life. Just there's this episode and this episode and this episode, and kind of hitting some highlights. And the same with all the Bible characters. Sometimes it's one particular event that we'll get a lot more details about. For example, in the book of Esther or Ruth or the Song of Solomon. or Job, but a lot of times they're just particular episodes. And so these episodes are given so that they might teach us. So we can learn from the history of the Bible. We learn from these people what we should do and what we shouldn't do, but we also learn that God is always a player in history, even when we don't see him. But here's the main thing I want to talk about for just a couple of minutes on this Thanksgiving Day. Our faith, our salvation, is not rooted and grounded in teachings or sayings, even though there are teachings and sayings in the Bible, like the book of Proverbs is full of sayings. There's plenty of sermons that are found, like by the Apostle Paul or James. I mean, a lot of the letters are essentially teachings. But really, we're saved by history. If I was to ask you, what does it take for a person to go to heaven? They would say, well, you need to believe in Jesus. But what does that mean? We believe in what Jesus did in history. Jesus was actually born in a real place called Bethlehem, in a stable. He was raised in the town of Nazareth. Jesus really did teach, particularly in the area of Galilee. Jesus really did go to Jerusalem, really was betrayed by a real person called Judas. Jesus really was beaten and mocked and whipped and a crown of thorn on his head. All that's history. It happened. And Jesus died on a cross in history. And the Roman Empire was a real empire. And they really did execute people by crucifixion. Like, it's all history. We are saved by what Jesus did in history. Not just a story about some guy in a galaxy far, far away or once upon a time, and it's not real. It's just intended to teach a moral lesson. No, the Bible's not stories to teach moral. I mean, they are to teach moral lessons, but a lot more than that. They're to show us that God is in control of history, that God works in history. And the ultimate event in history is what Jesus did, his death, and historically 3 days later, Jesus rose from the dead. The fact that Jesus did it in history is the foundation of our faith. We are saved by what someone did in history, and that someone is Jesus Christ. So today, as you give thanks for what God has done in history for our country, what God has done in history for your family, what God has done in history for you in your life, be most thankful for the greatest thing that God ever did in history, which was sending his son Jesus to be born of a virgin, live a sinless life, die on the cross in our place as a substitute for us, to be buried, to rise again, to send back to heaven. And here's the best news of them all for us, that someday Jesus is going to come back in history and snag us all up to go and spend forever with him in heaven. So I hope this just encourages you on this Thanksgiving Day to be thankful for what God has done in history. So may God bless you, and may you have a wonderful Thanksgiving.